The Atacama Desert wanted everything dead, and most days Marcus Cole was fine with that. He liked the silence, the way the ground stretched flat and pale and empty for so many kilometers that the horizon stopped meaning anything. No people, no conversations, no one asking how he was doing with that look on their face, the one that said they already knew the answer and wished they hadn't asked. He was running a mineral survey for a company whose name he'd already forgotten. Point the scanner, walk the grid, log the readings, collect the check. Simple work for a man who'd made his peace with simple. The ground-penetrating radar beeped wrong at 14:07 on a Tuesday. Marcus stopped walking. He looked at the screen. The anomaly sat 2 meters below the surface, roughly the size and shape of a large coffin. Too dense for height, too uniform for any natural formation he'd catalogued in 11 years of survey work. The radar signature was smooth, geometric, and it was giving off a faint energy reading that his equipment was not designed to detect, but was detecting anyway, like a radio picking up a station from a country that didn't exist. He should have logged it and called it in. He dug. 3 hours with a folding shovel in 40-degree heat. His shoulders burned. His water ran low. He kept digging, because something in his gut, the same gut that had kept him alive in places the government said he'd never been, told him that whatever was down there, it wasn't going to wait for a committee. The shovel hit something that wasn't rock. He cleared the dirt with his hands. Beneath the sand and clay was a surface that looked like glass, but wasn't. It was warm. It hummed against his palms with a low vibration he felt in his teeth. Translucent, pale blue, and inside it, Marcus stopped breathing. Close enough to trick the eye for half a second, but wrong in ways that piled up fast. Her skin was pale violet, like a bruise that had learned to be beautiful. 4 delicate ridges, like fins, like ears, like something between the two, ran along the sides of her skull, where hair should have been. Her fingers had an extra joint. Her closed eyes were too large for her face. She looked about 15. She looked like she was sleeping. She looked like someone had put her in a glass coffin and buried her in the deadest desert on Earth, and walked away. Marcus had seen enough damage in his life to recognize it when it stood in front of him. The pod, he was calling it a pod now, his mind filing it under whatever category kept him functional, was cracked. Not from the impact of a crash, not from age. The cracks ran along the surface in deliberate patterns, concentrated at the seams, at the points that mattered. Someone had damaged this thing on purpose. They'd cracked just enough to let it fail slowly, to let whatever kept the girl alive drain out, drip by drip in the dark. This was not an accident. This was a burial. He looked at the girl's face, at the way her violet fingers were curled against her chest, protecting nothing, holding on to nothing, at the thin line of dried fluid along one sealed eye that might have been a tear, or might have been something his species didn't have a word for. He thought about calling someone, the authorities, the military, a university, anyone with the proper equipment and the proper training and the proper clearance to handle a situation like this. He thought about what those people would do to her. He popped the pod. It split along the damaged seams with a hiss that smelled like ozone and copper and something sweet he couldn't name. The gel inside was thin and warm, and it spilled across the desert floor like blood from a wound that had been held closed too long. The girl's body settled against the base of the pod, and for one horrible second she didn't move, and Marcus thought he'd been digging up a grave after all. She gasped. The sound was wet, ragged, animal. Her 2 large eyes flew open. The irises were gold, shot through with veins of black, and she scrambled backwards so hard she cracked the far wall of the pod with her spine. She screamed in a language made of sounds his throat could never produce, syllables that rose and fell like birdsong played at the wrong speed. She was terrified. Of him, of the light, of the air, of everything. Marcus raised both hands, palms out. The universal gesture, or at least the human one, for I am not going to hurt you. He took 3 steps backward. Then 3 more. He sat in the dirt. She stared at him from the broken pod, shaking, her golden eyes tracking every micro-movement of his hands, his face, his breathing. She was coiled like something ready to bolt or bite, and he understood that posture. He'd worn it himself for 2 years after he came home. Marcus reached into his pack, slowly, no sudden moves. He pulled out his water bottle and a protein bar. He set them on the ground between them. Then he scooted back to his original spot and sat down again. And he waited. The sun moved, shadows stretched, the desert did what it always did, which was nothing at all. Marcus sat. The girl watched. An hour passed, 2. His skin burned, his lips cracked. He didn't move. She was a kid, she was scared. The rest was details. At the 2-hour mark, her shaking slowed. At 3 hours, her posture shifted from cornered animal to something more like exhausted animal. At some point, she blinked at the water bottle with an expression that crossed every species barrier ever built. Thirst was thirst. She reached for the water. Her violet fingers closed around the bottle, and she drank in desperate, gasping pulls, water spilling down her chin and throat and pooling in the hollow of her strange collarbone. She ate the protein bar in 2 bites, wrapper and all, and Marcus made a mental note to bring better food next time. Next time, as if this was a thing that had a next time, as if he'd already decided. He'd decided the moment he saw the cracks on the outside of the pod. The girl looked at him. Her gold eyes were wet. Her frills lay flat against her skull, pressed down, submissive, a gesture he read without understanding how. She opened her mouth, and from her throat came a single word, not in her language, not in his. In something older, deeper, something that bypassed his ears entirely and landed in the center of his brain like a stone dropped in still water. Why? Marcus looked at her for a long time. Because you were alone, he said. She didn't understand the words, but she understood something, because her frills lifted, just slightly, and she didn't look away. The desert was quiet. The pod hummed its dying hum. Somewhere above them, the sky held its breath. Marcus Cole had found a girl in the ground, and he was not the kind of man who walked away from that. He never had been. 3 weeks. That was how long it took to teach an alien girl that not every hand was a fist. Marcus brought her to his cabin. It wasn't much. 4 walls, a generator, a satellite connection he mostly used to file survey reports, and a bed he gave to her, while he slept on a cot near the door. Not because he was noble, because if something came through that door in the night, he wanted to be the first thing it met. The girl, he didn't have her name yet, couldn't pronounce most of the sounds she made, spent the first 4 days in the corner of the bedroom with a blanket pulled over her head. She came out for water. She came out for food. She went back under the blanket. He didn't push. On the 5th day, she watched him cook eggs. She sat on the floor near the kitchen, with her knees pulled up, and her gold eyes tracking the movement of his hands. The pan, the butter, the way the eggs changed from liquid to solid. She pointed at the stove and made a sound like a question. Marcus pointed at the stove and said, "Stove." She tried the word. It came out wrong. He didn't correct her. That was how the language started. Stove, water, door, sky, slow. 1 word at a time, placed between them, like small, careful stones across a river. Neither of them could see the bottom of. She was fast, scary fast. By the end of the first week, she had 200 words, and was stringing them into sentences that were grammatically broken, but emotionally precise. Marcus, Outside. Danger. Yes? Meant, is it safe to go outside? The structure was wrong, but the meaning was perfect, and he wondered if her species learned language the way his learned to walk, not by understanding the mechanics, but by needing to get somewhere. By the second week, she told him her name, Kaelri. She said it with a click in the middle that he couldn't reproduce, so she taught him to say it without the click, and told him the shortened version was close enough. He asked her what it meant. She thought for a long time, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was looking for the right human words. Small sound before storm, she said. He didn't ask her to explain that. He didn't need to. The communication wasn't just language. Marcus realized during the first week that Kaelri could feel what he felt, not his thoughts. She was clear about that, almost offended when he asked. She sensed them the way a person might sense heat from a fire. Direction, intensity, texture. She told him that his emotional landscape was strange to her, that most Velthari, her people she called them Velthari, had emotional signatures like flat water, calm, controlled, functional. Marcus, she said, felt like weather. He didn't know what to do with that, so he made more eggs. The story came out in pieces, not because she was hiding it, but because she was translating a life into a language that didn't have the right shapes for it. The Velthari were old, spacefaring for thousands of years, organized into ruling clutches, family units that held power through something she called merit succession. Marcus listened and nodded and didn't interrupt, even when the knot in his stomach tightened with each new detail. Kaelri was the youngest of 7 siblings. 7, and among the Velthari, siblings were not allies. They were competitors. The clutch system rewarded strength, intelligence, ruthlessness. Resources went to the worthy. The unworthy were managed. Managed, Marcus repeated. Kaelri looked at the table. Her frills lay flat against her skull, in that posture he'd come to recognize as shame. Removed, she said. She told him the rest in a voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear it. She was different. Wrong, by Velthari standards. She had the empathy, the ability to feel others' emotions, and among her people, this was not a gift. It was a diagnosis, a cognitive defect, a sign of inferior neural architecture. The Velthari had spent generations breeding empathy out of their ruling lines. Kaelri was a throwback, a glitch in the bloodline. Her siblings had voted. 5 in favor. 1, the second youngest, a brother named Renvel, abstained. The sentence was burial on an uncontacted world, Earth, a primitive planet no one would think to check. She was meant to die in the dark, slowly, and no one would ever know. Renvel watched them carry her to the ship. He said nothing. He did nothing. Marcus sat very still for a long time after she finished. He was not a man who yelled. He'd learned a long time ago that the loudest anger was the quietest kind, the kind that sat in the chest like a coal and burned so steady it could last for years. Kaelri, he said. His voice was flat, level. She flinched anyway, because she could feel what was underneath it. Where I come from, we have a word for what your family did. She waited. We call it murder. The word landed in the room like something heavy falling from a height. And the ones who watched it happen and did nothing, he looked at her. We don't forgive them either. Kaelri stared at him, not with fear, with something closer to wonder, and closer still to grief. You have a word, she said. Made a word for this. Yes. Because it is not normal for you. It is the opposite of normal. Her gold eyes filled, not with tears. Velthari didn't cry the way humans did, but with a bioluminescent shimmer that ran along the edges of her irises, like light through cracked glass. It was the most alien thing he'd seen her do, and it was the most human thing he'd ever witnessed. Among my people, she whispered, it is just What happens? Marcus wanted to break something. A wall, a table, the entire Velthari political system, ideally with his bare hands. Instead, he stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured 2 glasses of water. He set one in front of her. He sat back down. "Not here," he said. "Not on this planet. Not while I'm breathing." She picked up the glass, held it in both hands like it was the only solid thing in the room. They sat in silence for a while. The kind where 2 people have said the hard thing, and now the air needs time to settle around it. That night, Marcus checked the pod one more time. He dragged it to the back of the property and covered it with a tarp. He told himself he was checking for tracking signals, for anything he might have missed. He found it on the 3rd pass. A small blinking node buried in the pod's base. Damaged, but active. A distress beacon. It was weak, barely a whisper in the electromagnetic spectrum. But it had been transmitting for 3 weeks, sending Kaori's coordinates into the black. Marcus stood in the desert dark and looked up at stars that didn't look the same to him anymore. Something out there had heard the signal. The atmospheric interference started at dawn. Marcus noticed it because his satellite connection dropped, and his satellite connection never dropped. The equipment was military grade, the kind that worked through sandstorms and solar flares and the general hostility of the universe. It didn't just die. Something was sitting between him and the sky, and it was big enough to cast a shadow across every frequency he could reach. He walked outside. The desert looked the same, flat, pale, brutally indifferent, but the air felt different, heavier, like the moment before a thunderstorm, except there were no clouds. Kaori was already standing at the window. Her frills were pressed so flat against her skull they looked painted on. "They're here," she said. She didn't need to explain who. Marcus could read the answer in the way her hands were shaking, not with fear exactly, but with the particular stillness of someone who had expected the worst, and was now watching it arrive on schedule. A Velthari retrieval craft, cloaked, holding position in low orbit. Sent, she told him, in a voice stripped of everything but fact, by her siblings. To confirm her death. To clean the evidence. To make sure the loose end was tied and buried and forgotten. "If they find me alive," she said, "they finish it. And me? You are a witness on a primitive world. They will consider you irrelevant. They will kill you because it is efficient, not because it matters." Marcus nodded. He'd been killed for worse reasons. "How many?" he asked. 2. Sensors, enforcement agents. They are trained, they are armed, they are faster and stronger than you. "Okay. Marcus." Her gold eyes were wide. "You do not understand. Veltari sensors have ended species-level resistances. You are one human with a shovel, some wire, and a real bad attitude." He was already moving toward the storage shed. "Kaori, I need you to tell me everything about how they track, how they see, how they move, and what they don't expect. Can you do that?" She stared at him. "You are going to fight them." It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. "I'm going to make them wish they'd picked a different planet." He had 48 hours, maybe less. Kaori told him what she knew. The sensors would descend on foot, following the beacon's signal. They would scan for life signs. They would be methodical, efficient, and utterly confident that nothing on an uncontacted world could threaten them. That confidence, she said, was their defining characteristic. Marcus had built a career on what happened to confident people who underestimated the terrain. He rigged the approach routes, not with anything sophisticated. He didn't have sophisticated. He had wire, rocks, a case of old mining detonators from the survey supply, and the kind of creativity that only comes from having been in situations where creativity was the difference between going home and going into the ground. Tripwires connected to noise charges, loose rock positioned above narrow passes. The cabin itself was a dead zone. He stripped it of anything useful and set up a secondary position in a natural rock formation 200 meters east, with sight lines on the cabin door and the beacon's location. He explained none of this to Kaleri. She didn't ask. She sat in the rock formation with him and watched him work with an expression he couldn't name. Something between disbelief and a feeling her people supposedly didn't have. The sensors came at night. 2 of them. Tall, almost 2.5 meters, built lean and precise, like weapons designed by someone who hated wasted material. Their skin was darker than Kaleri's, a deep indigo, and their frills were rigid, upright, signaling dominance in a language Marcus's body understood, even if his brain didn't. They wore fitted suits that seemed to absorb light, and they carried sidearms that hummed with the same frequency as the pod. They walked toward the beacon like they were taking an evening stroll. No caution, no tactical spacing. Why would they bother? They were Velthari sensors on a world of primitives. The most dangerous thing here was the sun. The first one triggered the rockfall. 300 kilograms of desert stone balanced on a shelf Marcus had spent 6 hours weakening with a hammer and chisel, came down on the lead sensor like the mountain had an opinion. The impact was enormous. The sensor went down in a cloud of dust and noise and didn't get up. The second sensor moved so fast, Marcus almost didn't track it. One moment, it was standing next to its partner. The next, it was 10 meters to the left, weapon drawn, scanning the terrain with senses Marcus couldn't match. It found him in 4 seconds. The energy bolt hit the rock next to Marcus's head and turned it into glass. The heat washed over his face like opening an oven door. He rolled, came up running, and did the only thing he could think of that the sensor wouldn't expect. He ran toward it. The sensor fired twice more. One shot scorched the ground at Marcus's feet. The other grazed his shoulder, and the pain was white and total. And he used it, because pain was fuel, and he'd been running on that fuel for years. He hit the sensor at full speed. It was like tackling a steel beam covered in leather. The sensor was stronger, faster, better equipped. It grabbed Marcus's arm and twisted, and something in his elbow made a sound that arms should not make. Marcus grabbed the sensor's weapon arm with both hands, and he held on. The sensor struck him, in the ribs, in the face, in the already broken arm. Each hit was precise and devastating, and delivered with the calm efficiency of a species that had never encountered a creature too stupid or too stubborn to let go. Marcus held on. Blood in his mouth, stars in his vision. His fingers locked around that arm like they were welded there. Because he knew something the Velthari didn't. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the smartest. But they were the species that decided when to stop. And Marcus Cole had decided he was not going to stop. The sensor's confidence broke. Marcus could see it. A flicker in those dark eyes. A shift from annoyance to confusion to something the Velthari probably didn't have a name for, but humans called, "Oh no." That was when Kaleri stepped out from behind the rocks. Marcus saw it from the ground, still clinging to the sensor's arm. She stood in the moonlight, with her frills fully extended, spread wide like a crown, like a warning, like something ancient and terrible. And she opened her mouth, and the world changed shape. It wasn't a sound. It was a wave. Marcus felt it pass through him like warm water, and for a moment he felt everything he'd ever felt at the same time. The grief and the fury and the desperate need to protect this girl he'd found in the dirt. It was the longest half-second of his life. The sensor got the full blast. Every emotion Kaleri had absorbed from Marcus. Every shade of human feeling. The love, the rage, the stubborn refusal to let go. The bone-deep belief that a stranger's life mattered as much as your own. She channeled it all into a single psychic burst and drove it into the sensor's mind like a nail. The sensor dropped, not dead, overwhelmed, its body locked rigid on the desert floor, frills twitching, eyes wide and unseeing. It was drowning in emotions its species had spent generations removing. It had never felt so much. It had never felt at all. Marcus let go of the arm. He rolled onto his back in the dirt, breathing hard, bleeding from places he hadn't counted yet. The stars above him were blurry and beautiful. Kaori knelt beside him. Her frills were still extended. Her gold eyes burned. "You held on," she said. "Yeah. You should not have been able to hold on. Nobody told me that." She made a sound that might have been a laugh in a language he didn't speak. The cloaked ship in orbit was already transmitting. Marcus didn't know the specifics yet. That would come later, when they pulled the data from the downed sensors equipment. But the message was already flying across the dark between stars, carrying a report that would change the way the Velthari looked at this small blue world and its small, stubborn people. The message, translated roughly, said this: "The defective is alive. The native is anomalous. Requesting elevated response." Marcus lay in the dirt and looked up at the sky he'd been looking at his whole life. "We need to stop running," he said. "We need to make them not want to come back." At his broken arm and his burned shoulder and his bloody, grinning, impossible face. "How?" she asked. Marcus sat up. It hurt in ways he'd catalog later. "I know some people," he said. The people Marcus knew were the kind of people who didn't exist on paper. Sarah Okafor, former NSA signals analyst, fired for asking questions about a file she wasn't supposed to know existed. Now, she lived in a shipping container in New Mexico, with more processing power than most universities. Tom Garrett, retired Marine explosive ordnance disposal tech, who grew organic tomatoes in Montana and could still disarm a bomb blindfolded with 2 fingers. Priya Ramaswamy, astrophysicist, who left Caltech after a funding disagreement that she described as a philosophical difference, and everyone else described as her throwing a chair at the dean. There were others: a hacker in Sao Paulo who went by the name Moth, a linguist in Reykjavik named Byrne who spoke 11 languages and had been waiting his entire life for a 12th that didn't come from Earth, a retired intelligence officer named Chen, who asked exactly one question when Marcus called: "Is she safe?" and was on a plane within the hour. Marcus didn't contact governments. He didn't trust institutions with Kaori. He'd seen what institutions did to things they didn't understand. They studied them, classified them, took them apart to see how they worked, and never quite got around to putting them back together. He trusted people. Within 3 weeks, the cabin in the Atacama had become something between a refugee camp and a war room. Sarah set up communications. Tom fortified the perimeter. Priya studied the captured sensor equipment with the frantic joy of a woman who had just been handed proof that everything she'd ever theorized was correct. Kaori watched all of this, with her frills in a position Marcus had learned to read as confused wonder. "You called them," she said to Marcus, on the 4th day. "They came." "Yeah. Why did they come?" "Because I asked." "That is not an answer." Marcus considered this. "On Earth," he said, "if someone you trust tells you there's a kid in trouble, you don't ask a lot of follow-up questions." Kaori's frills shifted. "Even if the kid is not your species?" "Especially then. Humans have a thing about strays." She didn't have a word for strays in Velthari. Marcus explained it. Her frills went through 3 different positions before settling on something he hadn't seen before, a kind of slow rippling motion that moved from front to back like wind through grass. He asked her what that meant. The closest she could get was an emotion that is painful and warm at the same time. Byrne, the linguist, overheard this, and spent the next 2 hours trying to determine if the Velthari had independently developed a concept similar to the Japanese word mono no aware. Kaori endured his questions with the patient exhaustion of a teenager who had been adopted by enthusiastic nerds. The plan took shape over weeks. It began with the sensor equipment. Priya and Sarah cracked the communications array first, not because it was easy, but because Velthari encryption was designed to keep out Velthari. It had never been tested against humans, and it turned out that human code-breaking methods were so fundamentally different from Velthari approaches that the encryption didn't recognize them as attacks. The system was looking for a knife. It didn't know what to do with a can opener. Kaori provided the context. She taught them the structure of Velthari political communications, the hierarchies, the broadcast frequencies, the difference between ruling clutch channels and civilian networks. The distinction was critical. The ruling clutches controlled information with absolute precision. The average Velthari citizen lived inside a carefully constructed reality, where competitive inheritance was described in clean, clinical terms. Merit selection, optimization of lineage resources, natural consolidation. Nobody called it what it was. "Your civilians," Marcus said during one late-night planning session, "they don't know the truth." "They know what they are told," Kaori said. "The clutches control the telling. So what happens if someone else does the telling?" Kaori looked at him. Her gold eyes held something complicated. "No one has ever tried," she said. The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. They would broadcast Kaori's testimony, her story, her burial, the vote, the cracked pod, all of it, directly into the Velthari civilian communication networks. Not the ruling channels, the public ones. The ones that billions of ordinary Velthari use every day. Kaori would tell the truth, and the truth would do what truth does when it enters a system built on lies. She recorded her testimony in one take. Sitting in a folding chair in the desert, frills relaxed, speaking Velthari with the steady precision of someone who had rehearsed this in her head every night since the pod closed above her. She described the vote, the faces of her siblings, the sound the pod made when it sealed, the darkness, the cold, the moment she accepted she was going to die. She described Marcus, the dirt under his fingernails when he opened the pod, the way he sat in the desert for 3 hours and waited. The eggs. The room was very quiet when she finished. Tom Garrett, a man who had disarmed bombs in 4 countries and cried at exactly 1 movie in his entire life, turned away and pretended to check his equipment. Then Rinvel made contact. It came through the captured sensor's communication array, an encrypted burst aimed directly at the pod's frequency. Priya almost missed it. When they decrypted it, the message was short, formal, and addressed to Kaori by her full clutch name, which Marcus had never heard before, and which contains 17 syllables. Rinvel offered a deal. He would provide the access codes needed to bypass the Velthari broadcast security, a thing that would take Sarah and Moth months to crack on their own. If Kaori agreed to silence. Bury the testimony. Let the narrative stand. In exchange, Rinvel would ensure that the retrieval order was cancelled. She could live on Earth, quietly, forgotten. It was, by Velthari standards, an act of extraordinary generosity. Marcus told him no. Kaori told him why. She spoke to her brother through the array with Marcus and the team listening. Her voice was different when she spoke Velthari, lower, more melodic, carrying frequencies that hummed in the team's bones. Marcus asked Byrne for a translation afterward. Byrne's eyes were red. She said, roughly, "You didn't vote to kill me, Ren, but you watched them carry me to the ship." On this planet they had a saying, "The only thing necessary for evil to succeed is for good people to do nothing." You were the good one. That's what makes what you did worse. The channel was silent for almost 2 minutes after she finished. Then Rinvel sent the codes. Not for the deal. He sent them because for the first time in his life, he felt something his species didn't have a word for. Burns said the closest human word was shame. Sarah integrated the codes immediately. The broadcast system was ready. The testimony was loaded. Moth had built a signal relay that would bounce the transmission through 17 nodes before hitting the Velthari civilian networks, making it impossible to trace back to Earth in time to stop it. Everything was ready. Then Priya's atmospheric sensors went wild. A Velthari diplomatic cruiser, armed, massive, built for intimidation in the way that only powerful civilizations build things, had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system. It was moving inward, fast. The transmission that came with it was on every frequency. The voice was cold, precise, and broadcast in both Veltari and in a gesture of calculated contempt, accented English. I am Threxul, first of the third clutch. You will return the defective. You will surrender the contaminated natives, or I will sterilize your world's surface. You have one planetary rotation to comply. The room went quiet. Marcus looked at Sarah, at Tom, at Priya and Byrne, and the face of Kelri, who was staring at the speaker with her frills pressed flat and her golden eyes burning. Broadcast it, he said. All of it, right now. Sarah's hands were already moving. The broadcast hit the Velthari civilian networks like a rock through a cathedral window. 17 relay nodes, 11,000 civilian channels. Billions of Velthari who had never once questioned the phrase, natural consolidation of merit, received, in the same instant, the face of a 15-year-old girl, describing how her siblings voted to bury her alive on a planet no one would think to check. Kaelri spoke for 9 minutes. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She described the vote the way a scientist describes an experiment, with precision, with clarity, with the devastating calm of someone who had already survived the worst and had nothing left to lose. She described the 5 who voted yes. She named them. She named their positions in the clutch. She named the assets they controlled, and the channels they used, and the clinical phrase they'd placed in the official record. Resource reallocation of a non-viable line member. She described Rinvel, who abstained. She described his face as they carried her away. She described the pod, the cracks, the dark. And then she described the human who dug her out of the ground and sat in the dirt for 3 hours because he didn't want to scare her. On the Veltari homeworld, the reaction was immediate. Not all Veltari lacked empathy. The ruling clutches had spent generations selecting against it, breeding it out of their bloodlines, treating it as a defect to be managed. But empathy isn't a switch, it's a spectrum. And among the billions of ordinary Veltari, the workers, the engineers, the teachers, the ones who had never been tested for it because they were too common to matter, buried, unnamed, expressed sideways in small kindnesses that the culture had no framework for. Kaelri's broadcast gave it a name. The civilian networks overloaded within the first hour. Communications between the homeworld and the outer colonies shut down under the weight of a conversation that had never been allowed to happen. Velthari parents looked at their children and thought about votes and pods and dark planets and the terrible efficiency of things they'd been told were normal. Aboard the diplomatic cruiser, Threxul watched the chaos spread and felt something he had never felt before. He identified it, incorrectly, as tactical inconvenience. "Jam the signal," he ordered. His communications officer turned from the console. "First, the signal is not coming from one source. It is distributed across 17 nodes and has been cached in local storage on every civilian hub in the inner systems. We cannot suppress it without shutting down the entire civilian network. Then, shut it down. That action would confirm the broadcast's content. The public would interpret suppression as admission. Threxel's frills snapped rigid. Charge the orbital weapons. We proceed with the sterilization. The weapons officer hesitated. Among the Veltari, hesitation in the face of a direct order was almost unheard of. It was the kind of thing that ended careers, bloodlines, entire branch families. First, the weapons officer said, there is a second transmission. The bridge crew watched it on the main display. It was Marcus's addition, not Kaelri's testimony. She'd said her piece. This was something different. Something the team had assembled in the last 72 hours from every archive, every database, every scrap of recorded history they could access. It was a montage. No narration. No explanation. Just images, one after another, drawn from every century and every continent of human civilization. A firefighter carrying a child out of a burning building. Strangers forming a human chain in floodwater to reach a drowning woman. A soldier, enemy uniform, different flag, being carried to a medic by the man who'd shot him 10 minutes earlier. A crowd of people digging through earthquake rubble with bare hands, pulling out survivors they'd never met. A woman in a refugee camp sharing her last piece of bread with someone else's child. Hundreds of images. Thousands of moments. A species that fought and failed and starved and burned, and through all of it, kept reaching for each other. Not because it was logical. Not because it was efficient. Because something in the wiring of their small, fragile, stubbornly hopeful brains would not let them walk past a person in pain. The final frame was Marcus, sitting in the Atacama dirt, sunburned, dehydrated, waiting. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the pod, at the girl inside. And then his voice, speaking Velthari, rough, accented, each word placed with the care of a man building something he wanted to last. You left your child on our world because you thought we were primitives. You were right. We are. We are the kind of primitives who find a stranger's kid buried in the dirt, and instead of walking away, we dig. The bridge of the diplomatic cruiser was silent. Threxel stared at the display. His frills had gone through several positions during the broadcast, and settled on one that none of his crew had seen before. A slow, involuntary tremor that the ship's medical system flagged as an unknown emotional response. Charge the weapons, he said again. His voice was quieter. No one moved. I gave an order. He was young, from a minor clutch, the kind of Velthari who would never have been tested for empathy, because no one thought it mattered what he felt. No, he said. The word hung in the air like the first crack in a dam. Rinvel's voice came over the ship's internal communication. He was somewhere in the lower decks, surrounded by junior officers and crew members who had been watching the broadcast on their personal devices. And his voice was calm, in the way that Kaelri's voice had been calm. The calm of someone who had made a decision they couldn't take back. This ship will not fire on that planet, Rinvel said. Threxel, brother, it's over. The mutiny was quiet. There was no violence. The crew simply stopped obeying, the way a machine stops working when you remove one small essential piece. Threxel gave orders. No one followed them. He threatened consequences. No one cared. The broadcast had shown them something they couldn't unsee, and the weapons officer's single word of refusal had given them permission to feel it. Threxel was escorted to his quarters by 2 officers who couldn't look him in the eye. Not out of respect, out of something new, something that smelled faintly like the shame Rinvel had learned from a human translation of a quote about evil and good people and silence. The Velthari ruling council had no choice. The civilian population was in an uproar that couldn't be suppressed without confirming everything the broadcast had claimed. Clutch leaders across the inner systems were already distancing themselves from the third clutch. The political structure that had held for centuries was cracking along lines that had always been there, but had never been tested. They opened negotiations, not with Earth's governments, They didn't know Earth had governments, and Marcus preferred to keep it that way. They negotiated with Kael'ri, the youngest, the defective, the one they'd buried. She sat across from the council's representative via long-range communication, her frills extended, her gold eyes steady. She was 16 by now, if you counted the Earth years she'd lived through. She spoke with the vocabulary of someone who had learned what words could do when you chose them carefully. She'd learned that from Marcus, though she'd never tell him so, because he'd get that uncomfortable look and go make eggs. The terms were straightforward. Velfari competitive inheritance would be subject to independent civilian oversight. The practice of eliminating defective clutch members would be formally abolished, and Earth, small, primitive, violent, compassionate, stubborn Earth, would be recognized as a sovereign world under galactic treaty. Kael'ri chose to stay. Not as a refugee, as a bridge. The first Veltari ambassador to Earth, appointed by no clutch, endorsed by no council. She chose it herself, which was the most human thing she'd ever done, and the most Veltari thing anyone had done in generations. The galaxy watched. Other species, the ones who had dismissed Earth as a backwater full of short-lived primates with too many emotions and not enough sense, saw the broadcast. They saw the montage. They saw the images of humans pulling strangers from rubble, and sharing food with enemies, and sitting in the dirt for hours, because a scared kid needed someone to not be a threat. And they were unsettled. Not because humans were strong, not because humans were smart, not because humans had built ships or cracked codes, or won a fight against a Veltari censor through sheer unwillingness to let go. Because humans cared about things that didn't benefit them. They protected things that weren't theirs. They adopted everything. Animals, ideas, causes, alien teenagers found half dead in the desert. And once they decided something belonged to them, they would burn the world down before they let it be taken. That was the part that frightened the galaxy. A journalist found Marcus eventually. They always do. She was from Buenos Aires, sharp and persistent. And she sat across from him in the cabin that still smelled like desert dust and Kael'ri's cooking experiments, and asked the question everyone wanted answered. Why did you do it? You didn't know what she was. You didn't know what would happen. Why did you risk everything for a girl you found in the ground? Marcus thought about it. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was the kind of man who wanted to say things once and say them right. She was a kid, he said. She was alone. He looked out the window, where Kael'ri was arguing with Priya about astrophysics, in a mix of English and Veltari, her frills rippling with that warm, painful emotion she still couldn't translate, while Tom watered his tomatoes, and Byrne recorded everything with the obsessive joy of a man who had found his 12th language at last. That's all I needed to know. Years later, when Kael'ri stood before the Galactic Assembly as Earth's first interstellar representative, the species who watched her were not watching her. They were watching the humans behind her. The scrappy, loud, contradictory, infuriating, impossible humans who had looked at a universe of civilizations more ancient and powerful than themselves, and responded not with submission or aggression, but with the one thing no one had expected. They cared. And if you buried someone on their planet, they would find them.